I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we're going to do one of my favorite types of color mixing, the triangle color mixing exercise, but finally I will be doing a twist that has been highly requested. We're going to double the yellow. I'm going to talk more about how this color mixing exercise is set up in a moment. But typically whenever I do one of these, the yellow gets easily overwhelmed by whatever colors I'm mixing with, whether I'm using a cyan and magenta as I'm planning to use today, or if I'm using a red and a blue. And that's because when you use the exact same amount of dye, the red and the blue are just more saturated, intense colors than the yellow. And I'm not a color theory expert, but to get a colorway, a rainbow that feels balanced for a green, and often for greens and for oranges, you need to use more yellow than the cyan or magenta. And even in this triangle here, you can see that when we step from 100% yellow to 25% yellow, 75% of either the blue or the pink, there's a big transition there. It's not subtle, whereas the transitions from our blue or our pink into the other colors is a lot more gradual. So the plan today is to take the original project and double the yellow to see where we end up while keeping the total amounts of blue and pink the same. Here I have just some digital representations of this. I used some kind of digital mixing program to add the right ratios of the colors. And I mean, this is not a perfect representation of what I actually got when I mixed those colors, but I mean, it could give us something more balanced because this one does look more balanced now that I've doubled the yellow. The one note is that I don't think the digital color mixing increases the saturation of the colors because I can't add something at, say, 150%. I can only bring things up to 100. So we're looking at the hues more than the intensity of the colors. Why have I not done this sooner? Well, when I did this original triangle, I can look at this and know exactly how much dye and the proportion of the colors in each of the samples. I know that the middle of each of the lines is going to be a 1-to-1 ratio of the two colors on the corner. I know that the other two samples will be either a 1-to-3 or a 3-to-1 ratio because each of those samples have the exact same amount of dye added into the container. But when we go ahead and double the yellow, we're changing those proportions that we have along the side. So instead of a 3-to-1, 1-to-1, and 1-to-3 ratio, now we have a 6-to-1, 4-to-2, and then 2-to-3 ratio. And the total amount of dye that we have in each of these samples is now going to vary from a 2% depth of shade, or the equivalent of 2 grams of dye per 100 grams of yarn, all the way back down to the 1% depth of shade of that blue. And I am going to admit that figuring out these ratios and the depths of shade, I'm a math person, but even my head struggled to look at this and think about this, and it wasn't as easy and handy as a resource because I think we're gonna get a really cool triangle, but I don't think that that finished picture is gonna be as intuitive for me to look at as looking at my original triangles and then knowing at the proportions of the colors I've mixed. Because I've done these triangles with more than just primary colors and things like that. Now, I know our introduction is getting long, but I figured that all of these things were really important to explain before we jump on in to the yarn dyeing. And, oh man, I'm trying to think. I probably somewhere have that original triangle that I showed pictures of, but I don't think I know where it is or if I'd be able to say, oh, it's the Dharma dyes versus Jacquard. So I'm not going to be able to compare the yarn under the same lighting next to each other in the end, but we will be able to look and see, does the yellow feel more included in the triangle? Does it feel more balanced? Or is our yellow still like the least dominant player in here? Let's go look at our colors and make some dye stocks. The 3 colors we are going to use today are Dharma Acid Dye's Brilliant Yellow, Caribbean Blue, and Deep Magenta. I put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves to start making our liquid dye stocks that we'll then use for our color mixing. And I am going to do something different at this step in that I am going to make our yellow stock solution more concentrated than our magenta or Caribbean blue. I'm going to be mixing the yellow at a 1% stock solution, where we have 1 gram of dye per 100 milliliters of liquid. And then our Caribbean blue and deep magenta, I'm going to be using double the volume of water here, giving us a 0.5% stock solution concentration, where we have half of a gram of dye per 100 grams of yarn. This means that I'm going to be able to add the exact same volumes when I'm playing with either the yellow as compared to the blue or the pink, and this is going to make it easier for me to think about how I'm doing this when we get to the step where I'm actually measuring out the dyes. I measured out all of the dyes into glass jars and used some boiling water to help me dissolve them before bringing up the volume to the total amount that I wanted for the project. Then I set all the dyes aside in some stock solutions containers so that way we could get ready to start measuring out the colors. I set things up this way because I already had sort of in my color mixing folder this triangle with a recipe of the number of milliliters of dye stocks I needed to add. And I even had a note on here that if I'm going to use 20 gram mini skeins and planning to dye them at a 1% depth of shade, to use a 1% stock solution for all of these measurements. But if I'm using 10 gram mini skeins, then to make my stock solutions at a 0.5%, so then I can work on measuring out larger volumes of liquid for each of the samples, just because it's easier to manage. And so this is just a reminder that the volume of dye you're adding into your sample is not the only variable that's important. The stock solution concentration is as important as well. And that is where I'm doubling the yellow here today. For our triangle today, we are going to dye some 10 gram mini skeins. This is Wool to Dye For Sheila's Titanium. Each 10 gram mini is 75% superwash merino wool, 25% nylon. And I've pre-soaked 15 of them in some plain tap water with no acid. So that way we can try to get mostly even color coverage on the yarn once we set up all of our dyes. And speaking of setting up our dyes and mixing the dyes, let's go start measuring things out. I have 15 cups here, each with 1 cup of water. These are the small standard takeout containers, and I love using them to dye yarn. Now we're gonna start with the yellow, and this is our 1% stock solution. I have a 0.5 stock solution of the other 2 colors. And so the plan is gonna be to add 20 milliliters, 15, 10, and 5 of the yellow. And then we're gonna do the same volumes of our blue and then of our pink. So that way every container in here will have received a total of 20 milliliters of dye. But don't forget that because our brilliant yellow is twice as concentrated as our other 2 colors, the total amount of dye in each container is going to vary a bit. I mean, these containers will all have the exact same amount of dye, but where we have the yellow, we're gonna bring in some more variation. And to do these measurements, I'm gonna add some of our stock solution into a cup, and then I'll be using some different syringes to measure out the colors. Now, the yellow is the easiest. I have a bit of a bubble, so I'm measuring above. The yellow is the easiest one to measure out because the color is not as opaque as the colors are in our magenta and Caribbean blue. And so it's really easy to look at the lines and see where things go. 15. Okay, so I used a 20 milliliter syringe for those first 2. Now for this row, I'm going to use a 10 milliliter syringe because I can have the most precision, although the syringe is sticking a little bit, so I don't love that. I think I forgot about that from last time. You want to be really nice and slow. Now you'll notice, oh my, there we go. You'll notice that I had some yellow go over there. I am going to replace that. Okay, maybe for the other colors we'll use the 20 milliliter syringe. I'm not liking that 10, but let me refresh this water. It was only a drop, it's not that big a deal, but if I notice something like that, then I can always correct it. Okay, and now 5 milliliters. This syringe is really easy to use. Wonderful. This is why, one reason, and I made much bigger die stocks than I would need for today's project, because since these are primary colors, I can pull from them over and over for my yarn dyeing projects as needed, so I decided to make extras. But you always want to have a little bit extra, because what if I start adding the blue and then the blue jumps into here where there's not supposed to be any blue, then I might want to reset it. And you know, I actually see a little bit of a gradient of our yellow here. Like this looks lighter than that one. Sometimes with yellows, again, it can be a little bit hard to see some of those differences just because we would see the differences on the yarn, but those differences are more subtle than what we might see with the other colors. But anyway, I'm gonna go rinse out the syringes so we can add the rest of the dye. The second color I added was the Caribbean blue, which again, this is mixed at a 0.5% stock solution concentration. So as I add 20 milliliters of this to the corner, we're gonna have an equivalent of a 1% depth of shade in that corner compared to the 2% depth of shade we have of our brilliant yellow at the yellow corner. Caribbean blue can be a little bit of a pain to mix up, and so making the stock solutions with boiling water can really help dissolve it, because otherwise it just likes to clump on itself. I washed the syringes again and then brought over the deep magenta, using again between 20 milliliters and 5 milliliters of this 0.5% stock solution, which once again is 1/2 gram of dye per 100 milliliters of volume. One other thing worth noting is that the color transition along each of the sides of our triangle is a linear one. And so there is a possibility for the 3 mixed colors to be more similar to one another than to either the pink or the blue or the yellow. And so we could adjust the way the proportions are in the future if we wanted to try to get like a perfect triangle with a perfect blend. But the real point of this exercise is not to have a perfect triangle, even though we're trying to make a more perfect triangle in today's video. But the real purpose of this exercise is to come away with an understanding of the proportions of the colors you're mixing and how you might use those to get the color you want in the future. I still have not stirred things up. We will do that. But right here, right now, our Caribbean blue is looking very dominant because this triangle here is very dark. This one is looking a lot brighter. And the yellow does appear to be a little standout-ish, but we haven't added the yarn, and so then that can make a difference. And I just wanted to show you some calculations on how doubling the dye stock can double the amount of dye we're using. So 20 milliliters of a 1% dye stock would give us 0.2 grams of dye. 20 milliliters of a 0.5% stock, like we have with our blue and pink, gives us a 0.1 grams of dye. So we have 0.2 grams of yellow here and 0.1 grams of blue and pink there. Therefore, we have doubled the yellow. Now, the other way that I could have done this would have been to have all of our stock solution concentrations be exactly the same, and then double the volume for each of the yellows. But I preferred to do it this way because I was afraid that I would mess up if I was, and spilling a little bit, if I was gonna double the volume. And so this way I was able to add the exact same amount of dye into each of our containers. And we have some very pretty colors in here. Not surprising that this one will be very green. And this bottom row should be identical to the last time I did a triangle. Now, if it's not identical, that is likely measuring and user error. Just being honest. But now it's time to bring over the yarn. Trying to make sure the yarn is not tangled. And I'm also using fresh gloves. I reuse my gloves a lot. I'll rinse them and let them dry. But when I want to not mess up, sometimes it's nice to have fresh gloves because then you don't have some surprise dye in there. Ooh, this 2% yellow is really pretty. And we know our 1% of Caribbean blue and deep magenta. I actually, earlier this summer, did some depths of shade of the Caribbean blue and deep magenta. So I have that information now. Let's go for the 50-50. That orange is looking a little orange. That's good. That is a nice green. And this should be, this one is giving a little bit more blue than violet today. Hopefully I didn't not shake things too badly. Now this is a very nice yellow green, but we still have way more of a jump between the colors than what we'd had before. And actually there's a bigger jump now between the blue and that green because we've doubled. And so actually this is funny, rather than having a more complete triangle, I think that the pink also just is going to feel more different than the ones in the middle as well. That one is giving us very purple. Now, where could error come in when it comes to, did I add 2 skeins of yarn into any of these containers? Maybe I did? Did you get 20? Yes, you accidentally did. I could remeasure it entirely. I am not going to. What I'm going to do is squeeze out as much of the dye into there as I can. We will eventually steam set this guy. But thankfully I have more minis, and so I can grab another one to pop in for our final color. Now, if this was a scientific experiment, should I redo that sample entirely? Yes. Am I going to? No. Okay, this mini has also not pre-soaked nearly as long as any of the others. Where is that spoon? Oh dear, you know, sometimes things happen. And so the yellow is still very disconnected, and I'm surprised with how dominant the Caribbean blue is still feeling. I guess it shouldn't be a huge surprise. But I think that we would need to, in order to have the yellow feel more connected, I think that we really need to extend the entire triangle and make it larger, so that way some of these other colors can have a bigger overall impact. I think where I'm seeing the biggest impact, and this is all just very qualitative right now, is on these 3 in the middle that are all way more green leaning. Goodness, did I not shake the pink up enough? But that is looking where I would expect. Well, and so here we are. You know, it is more balanced in the sense that I would say our Caribbean blue feels like it's standing on its own a little bit. There's more of a gap between that and this green. And there's also more of a gap between the pink and then this very red color where we had a fair amount of yellow still. And these 3 samples in the center feel like their own little island and don't connect as much with these colors we have here. So I think it is more balanced than it was, but I don't think that necessarily you guys are going to be as happy with this as you are with the other. I'm now going to add 2 tablespoons of white vinegar to each of the containers. And so why do I think you guys are going to be a little disappointed with this result? I think that you guys were going to hope for like a better blend and mix of colors. And I think if you wanted a really good blend and mix around the outside of the triangle, then one of the things that you might want to do is do some more logarithmic mixing. So then some of the colors transition in a bigger way. So for example, if we had 50-50 here, and I guess it wouldn't have to be completely logarithmic. Yeah, I guess maybe it wouldn't be perfectly logarithmic, because if we did a logarithmic decrease of the yellow and a decrease of the pink, the colors would have a lot less pigment as we got over there. And so that would not be the best blend either, but I think a triangle that would feel more balanced would be, rather than having, I'm gonna go across the bottom because that's where this is consistent, rather than having 1-to-1, 3-to-1, 1-to-3, and then I guess 1-to-0 on the ends. If we had our 1-to-1 in the middle, but then had like 10-to-1 on each of the sides to really blend it, and you'd have to play around with that proportion a little bit to have something that feels a little bit smoother. But just doubling the yellow, I mean, it's not the worst. Like, we still have a really pretty rainbow and pretty result here. The problem is just that I would have to do some mental math if I wanted to say, look at this example and think, okay, how much yellow was here, how much blue? Whereas if all of the dyes, like if we have the same amount of dye in every container, then I could look at a sample like right here and know that this one is 75% Caribbean blue, 25% deep magenta. That's the recipe. I know, and I can go measure it and do that math. But anyway, we have acid in here now. We have, I guess we're gonna add some acid to this poor little guy. Give this little friend some vinegar and some water. But now I'm gonna get lids on everything. All these containers have, all these lids have numbers on them so I can put things in the right place. Oh my gosh. And the technique that I'm gonna do to help set the color is one that I like to call a cold process technique, where I'm gonna leave everything in these containers either outside or at room temperature indoors, depending on the weather. And I'm gonna let it sit for a couple of days. And in that time, because we have acid in these containers, these colors should start binding to the yarn. And then if the color binds completely, what I can do later is when I remove it, I can steam set a lot of this in batches and then spend less time heating and have less time going on my stove than maybe otherwise I would have. And certainly it would take less attention. Now, occasionally when I do this, there'll still be a lot of color left in a container. And then I can go ahead and steam everything within these containers as well. I think if I had a dedicated dye microwave, that would probably be the way to process this really nicely, because you can heat things up quickly in the microwave and let it cool off. But I don't have a dedicated dye microwave, and I don't want to put any dye in my kitchen microwave. That's my own preference. So I do it this way. And really, it's because I have limited heat sources available to me, and I find this to be easier. So anyway, I will be back in a couple of days, and we'll see what our colors are looking like. After 3 days, I brought all of the yarn inside and removed the lids. And now, the only little bit of dye I see is there's a little bit around the rim right there. That's just because it wasn't in contact with the yarn. But the one I'm the most curious about, our 2% depth of shade of our yellow absorbed just fine. Now, it's hard for me looking at this to think about what the other triangle looked like. We're gonna wait till things are dry to really compare the two, this triangle with the double yellow to the one with half as much yellow. But I would say the standout triangle is sort of this section here that feels darker. So what we have on the outside does feel reasonably balanced, but these three greens are really similar. We have a much bigger gap between our green and our blue because we have more yellow here, and we still have a big gap between our yellow and then the orange and the green. Now the reason why we now have a big gap between the green and the blue is because, if I'm remembering correctly, in the last triangle there was less of a transition here, and since we doubled the yellow, that's going to increase this gap here. Now in theory, you might have expected it to also increase this gap, and I think that the difference between like a pink and an orange is not as extreme, but I do think that this is a slightly bigger gap from our magenta to a true red. Like the three colors in the middle are very close together, or much closer to each other than they are to either end. So I think if we were gonna do this in the future, which I'm not planning on doing it again, but I would need to double the yellow, but then taper it more. And so bring it, double the yellow, and then maybe bring it lower as we approach the other color. But again, that's not really the point of the exercise. I'm still very glad we did it, but you'll let me know what you think. But now we need to start heat setting things. And so what I'm gonna do is just remove some of these samples so we can steam set, and you can see just how little color is left behind. Now, because the yellow is our star, what I'm gonna wanna do there is actually, I'm gonna remove the yellow, and then I'm just gonna add this liquid to other containers for now. I'm gonna steam set it within the container. That way it's not touching any of the other samples, and so that way we don't risk getting any color transfer on it. Because if we have color transfer between the blues and the greens, that's not gonna be very visible. If we had a color transfer between the green and the yellow, that would be a lot more obvious. And so now I can take the steamer basket and put some of this yarn around. I'm doing that here. Sometimes I'll attach the yarn to a zip tie at this stage, but this works well for keeping things separate, and you see the blues are not touching any of those pinks. And I'm gonna steam set that for 30 minutes. Now, as for these middle colors, what I want to make sure, there's definitely some breaking in here. Okay, but thankfully, I don't think you can see on camera with these colors, there's definitely one that's more yellow green, more blue green, and more pink green. I know that's really a weird way to put it, but it's the truth. And so knowing that I can tell the difference between those three samples in the middle is really handy. Now, the other thing that's handy is we do see a little bit of blues and some pinks left behind, but it's really not much. The area where we have the most color is, again, where a little bit of the color was on a lip. And so therefore, just popping this into a steamer basket, and oh yeah, we have our extra guy. That I accidentally added in to one of those oranges. I guess I'll pop that in the middle here just so I don't add any more color to it. But the amount left behind is super duper minor. If I wanted to, I could use this for some kind of leave no dye behind, which, ooh, maybe I'll do that later today. Maybe I will. So I'm gonna go ahead and just leave this here for now, and who knows, maybe I'll see it in another video. But in 30 minutes, I will remove the yarn from the steamer baskets. I just reduced the heat to low. You see how steamy we are. And I know I said that I was gonna remove it after the 30 minutes, but I think I'm gonna leave the lid off and leave it in the pot to cool. And I'm doing the same with the second pot that is just off screen over here. And Part of this is because I'm gonna let everything cool down. Part of it is that I'm not gonna be washing it for a number of hours anyway. And so why risk tangling the yarn if I can just set it aside? Now, if I wanted to, I could remove the steamer basket and set it aside, but a little more heat is not gonna hurt anything. The only reason why I'm even really mentioning this is that I'm doing something different from what I normally do, and it's not because I feel like this needs more heat, it's because this is what works for my schedule today. And a lot of times, that's how I make my decisions. After a couple of hours, the yarn had cooled completely, and so I gathered it up onto zip ties. I planned to be a little risky and wash everything together, but I still kept different bunches on separate zip ties so that way they could dry separately. This is probably overkill though. Because I'm nervous about back staining. By back staining, I mean color bleeding and then staining some of our other colors. We're gonna just add some soap to the water. And then I'm gonna bring in the yarn. And we're gonna quickly see, there's no reason why there should be any bleeding. And I'm not, like, maybe I see the tiniest hint of something. Ooh, these colors are so pretty. I will say that is one thing for sure. The oranges and the greens all feel very vivid. They don't feel more pastel because we doubled the yellow. Sometimes they feel less and less saturated in addition to more yellow or less blue or pink. And so that is pretty cool. But I'm very glad there is no bleeding. So glad. Because that means that you can really pump up that yellow and things work well. Now, is the steam set that I did 100% necessary? Maybe not, but there are colors where you do need that last bit of heat, and so I like to do that just to make sure things are well set. And again, if I wanted to set all 15 samples individually, that would have taken way longer than having 2 pots, 30 minutes, we're done. I probably would have had to do 2 or 3 rounds total with everything in their individual little containers. But anyway, through the spin dryer, hang it up to dry, and then we'll take a closer look. Here is our finished dry yarn, and I'm gonna quickly reassemble our triangle so we can take a look at the whole thing dry. But as I do that, I would like to give a huge shout out and thank you to Tamaris Fanas, Don Jans, Bernadette Crum, Jessica Parco, and the rest of the Fiber patrons whose names you see on the screen right now. Patreon is a great platform that allows you to support me directly, and there's lots of really fun perks, including early access to the Dyepot PS series and more. For more information, go check out patreon.com/ChemKnits. I don't really think I have any observations here that are that different from what I said while the yarn was still wet. Our yellow still feels a little left out, but I think that the saturation of these other colors stands up a little bit better to what we had when we use less yellow. But it is interesting that this blend here is a little better than now what we have for anything to do with the yellow, because we still have a big jump from the yellow to the next color, but then that's made a bigger gap between, I guess, this row and going up. And so we very much have this little triangle that's on its own. Like, I wouldn't say, oh, I feel like the blue triangle stands more than like the pink. It really does feel like a good old V and then a center triangle. But now let's go a little smaller and bring in, I guess, the midpoints. And these right here aren't 50-50. It's really 2 parts yellow to 1 part either blue or pink. And this, I don't think, gives us the best, quote, 6-color rainbow. I think if I were going to change, I would bring in the orange that is a little closer to the yellow. And then for our purple that feels like the, quote, midpoint, this is the 75% pink, 25% blue. And I think that that gives us what feels like a fairly balanced rainbow. I mean, maybe we want this green instead, because this is a hair blue. This one, oh gosh, this one is 3 parts blue, 2 parts yellow. So I don't know. I don't know which one of those is a little bit, quote, better overall. But as far as these 3 primaries go for being a cyan, a magenta, and a yellow, having it double still packs a having the yellow doubled packs a punch. It does not feel out of place here. I think if we had left the yellow as it was and doubled either one of the colors, then they would be more of the standout. But this is now where I'm gonna go and take a look at the triangle with everything at the same proportion. Okay, now is the point where I'm gonna take today's triangle and compare it with the triangle that I did in 2022, where all 3 colors were at a 1-to-1 ratio. And you guys, did I mess this up? Editing Rebecca's gonna have to go back and double check that I measured out double the yellow and that I did in fact have double the yellow going on here, because these look nearly identical. I mean, like this green here now is maybe less teal than the other one, but you guys. Okay, I went and looked, and I 100% did things correctly. I measured out 5 grams for each of the dye stocks. These 2 I dissolved in 1,000 milliliters in 1 liter, and this was 500 milliliters. I did everything right. I think that compared to the other one, this sample is a little more orange and a little less red. I think that this sample is a little bit more green versus just being more purpley, but oh my gosh, this made very, very little difference. I am floored at how little of a difference doubling the yellow meant. I think it just goes to show that the blue and pink are that much more dominant. And I know I popped up images and did something work, but I'm checking this out on my phone. I pulled up the video. That was some jacquard samples that I saved. And I don't know. It's just, it's way, way more similar than I thought. And so this is the problem with trying to make conclusions when you're looking at something without having something to compare it to. I'm gonna go twist up the minis and we'll keep talking. Now we do have one other bonus skein. We have this lovely like peach pink that has bits of yellow that I forget if she went into here or here. She went into one of these 2 jars by mistake. And if anything, it would have made either of them a hair more yellow, a hair less pink, because you can see that it absorbed more of the pink than the yellow that we had in there. So I don't think that it made a huge difference in the overall depth of color, but you know, I want to be transparent and say that I do make mistakes sometimes. Oh gosh, and had I left the 20 grams of yarn in that container overnight and they both had absorbed an equal amount of color, that would have affected the results that we saw. But anyway, now I really do need to twist everything. I intentionally did not look at the picture of the other triangle when I started this because I wanted to use what I was expecting in my mind's eye versus what was actually existing in the world. And I'm glad I did. And I mean, it shows that, oh my gosh, I mean, some of the differences maybe could be like mixing, measuring error, but yeah, sometimes to make a big change when you're dealing with proportions, you need to make a bigger change than doubling one, because that doesn't, I don't know, we need to have something that rather than being 6 parts yellow, 1 part blue, instead we need something that's like 15 parts yellow, 1 part blue. And to make those changes, even more extreme and decrease the amount of blue, not just increase the yellow. So we could play around with mixing more and do something similar to some of my like shades of color when I blend things together. We can play around with this in other kinds of way to see what kind of greens and things we can mix, or oranges. But I think that that would be way more informational for me because I know the way that I set up those grids compared to this, right, this triangle I did today where I just doubled the yellow, because I can't look at it and say, ooh, I want the recipe for that. I can give you the numbers and do that math in my head. I just can't. However, I am so glad that I did this project because this means that we learned something here today, and that if you want to get that more balanced rainbow, you may need to do more than just double things. Gosh, I wonder how much of a difference to your recipes does it, the batch of the pigment make with primaries? Because could one batch of the same primary color be less potent per gram than a different one? That I don't know. But anyway, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I really hope that you've enjoyed this video. I had a blast playing with this. I love doing color mixing, and I'm really happy I found a way for me to double the color and still make it really, really easy. Please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. And if you love the yarn I dye, go and check out the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. Thank you so much for watching.